For the first time, a senior member of the Canadian Defence Establishment has come out against the war in Afghanistan. Colin Kenny is chair of the Senate National Defence Security Committee. He's been to Afghanistan 3 times. He says the war is unwinnable. We'll hear from him in a moment. We'll also hear from retired Major General Lewis McKenzie, who, by the way, is just getting himself all prepared and been helping with the Army Marathon, which you'll be hearing more about later. Senator Kenny, why did you conclude as you did with this dramatic line in the op-ed piece that started in the Ottawa Citizen? You said, we're looking at Vietnam, a Canadian Vietnam.
Well, Craig, I reflected on it a lot. We went through the last election without a single politician saying a word about the war in Afghanistan or about defense or about foreign affairs. And we're coming up to an election now, and it's about time that we had Canadians talking about what's going on and expressing their views, and it needs to be part of the national debate as we go into an election. And the words that I used in the op-ed piece, frankly, I think there's a very broad sense of general support for what I said. I think some of the words are offensive. Probably Lou will point them out. But the issue is you got to do something to get Canadians away from the hush I talked about. There's a hush in the country, Craig, and it's out of respect for the families. It's out of respect for the soldiers. Nobody wants to say anything that could possibly upset the families or the soldiers, and so we don't have a debate.
But it's not an insult to the families of the soldiers to question the mission. We're not questioning their courage. So
read my mail, Craig, and you'll find that everybody confuses talking about the mission with the soldiers.
But
trust me.
You conclude, after being there 3 times, as somebody who's looked very closely at all of this, that we can't win this. What is it that caused you to finally come to that conclusion after having been wary, you'd say, for years?
Well, I knew what was coming out in the quarterly report that the government put out, and it's a sorry, sad tale. We aren't making the progress we wanted in terms of aid. We have Taliban influence spreading much farther across the country. It's remarkable how well our small number of troops have done. No significant change now that we're seeing large numbers of American troops in there. We've gone through another corrupt election. Yeah, well,
that's the point where I have to interject. But I'll let the senator finish.
Okay, but we've gone through another corrupt election. We have a situation where the drug trade in Helmand and Kandahar is at record levels, down elsewhere, but it's at record levels. We have the brother of the president who is a drug lord himself in Kandahar, and we have a government, a democratically, quote, elected government that's passing laws there that says it's okay for a husband to rape his wife.
General McKenzie?
This stinks.
Go ahead.
The senator's a friend. We're both members of the board of directors of the Canadian Defence Association Institute. He's a big supporter of the military. Therefore, we can disagree without being disagreeable. The timing of the article was lousy. The reason it was lousy is because for the first time since 2002, we have an area that we can control, in that the arrival of the American surge, the brigade and the Stryker brigade and the battalion of infantry, our area in Afghanistan has been reduced by 60%. And therefore, we have a much smaller area where we're stirring up a bunch of hornets' nests. We have more operations going on, contrary to what Margaret Went said, where we're hiding behind the wire in Kandahar airfield. We're out doing operations. The safest thing we do right now, paradoxically, is fight the Taliban in the outlying areas, because the most dangerous thing to do is drive around on the main highways.
But General, we're talking about the whole war,
absolutely,
not just the Canadian courageous contribution to it.
NATO failed miserably in the early stages to provide the resources necessary to take this thing to a proper conclusion early on. America has been peed off with NATO and is now injecting more troops than the other 41 nations combined and are taking the lead. And it's helping us out significantly in the South.
In fact, Senator, isn't it true that almost every one of the NATO nations, especially big ones like Germany, I mean big contributors like Germany, Holland, Italy, they're all questioning their commitment and talking about pulling out? Is there going to be anybody left there but Americans, and is that Vietnam?
I don't know. The countries you've mentioned all had caveats all over the place as well, and except for the Dutch and the British and maybe the Poles.
But are we seeing a Vietnam here?
Well, we're seeing something that's damned unpleasant, and you know, Lou is right that we have coming forward a new doctrine, if you will, or a new approach in Afghanistan. The problem is we've heard it all before. Triple D was the answer to things for a while. Defense, diplomacy, development. We hear from government about different innovations, and after a while you say, well, I'm sorry, you don't have any credibility.
But we
don't have clear goals in Afghanistan. One of the overwhelming things that comes in my mail is people say, why doesn't the government tell us what they want to achieve there?
But the whole concept of what is now affectionately known as clear, hold, develop, was a Canadian concept 5 years ago, but it couldn't be implemented because there were nowhere near the resources necessary to do it. Now we're modestly close in the South to doing that. And in fact, General McChrystal is going to adopt the Canadian concept throughout the country, and I think that's a compliment to Canadian planning.
But General, we do have a corrupt local ally, which sounds so familiar to me after my Vietnam experience. We do have constant calls for more troops, and the violence is increasing. Now it's increasing everywhere in the country. Why isn't there the danger? Because apparently Obama himself is fretting about Lyndon Johnson ruining his career at a time when he was doing a lot of social spending because of Vietnam.
Violence is increasing dramatically in the South for one reason and one reason only. That's because we are out there kicking the hornet's nest with additional resources. That's going to happen. Very, very few soldiers, fortunately, are being killed or wounded fighting the Taliban. It's terribly politically incorrect to talk about body counts, but the number of Taliban being killed by our troops these days in more operations that have ever been conducted in the entire campaign before is very high.
And by the way, the latest Canadian killed last week, a Quebecer, his body of that great young Canadian comes home today. So how much do we continue to contribute in terms of blood and treasure for what, Senator?
Well, my problem is this. Lou commented about kicking the hornet's nest, and we are friends, and I do respect him, and he's a hell of a guy, even if he is dressed funny. But the problem is, every time we kick the hornet's nest, we create another dozen Taliban, and it causes huge problems. You know, I've come to the conclusion that there's nothing we can do for the 131 that have died except mourn them, respect them, support their families, and there is something we can do for the next 130, and that is to have a real good look at whether what we're doing over there is worthwhile.
And maybe get out.
But the overwhelming response from the Afghan public when polls are taken, and God knows we're a poll country, indicate the last thing they want, the furthest thing from their mind is the return of the Taliban. They don't want that. As far as a corrupt government goes, Craig, you're absolutely right. The civilian component, which is now surging into Afghanistan, not just from the States but from Canada, was missing for the first 4 or 5 years, really. And that governance is probably the most important issue. You can have all the security you want if you have a corrupt government.
Gentlemen, I thank you both for a thoughtful discussion of this very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Craig.
I'm not dressed funny.
More than 10,000 people were out in the streets of Ottawa this morning for the annual Army Run. It's become an annual event, and this year, the contribution, the number of people in it, has gone up by 1/3. Proceeds from the Army Run, which also, of course, includes the Navy, Air Force, go to the Military Families Support Fund. And if you'd like to make a contribution to that very good cause, you can go to the CTV website, ctv.ca, and follow the directions of how to do that.